The mountain air cut through Captain Sarah Chen's lungs like broken glass as she scaled the rocky cliff face. Her fingers found purchase on ledges that seemed impossible to grip, while her body moved with the fluid precision of someone who had conquered heights that would terrify most people. Below her, a team of Navy SEALs watched through their scopes, timing her ascent with military precision. "Contact in 30 seconds, came the voice through her earpiece. Sarah's heart rate remained steady at 60 beats per minute, a biological anomaly that had earned her both admiration and suspicion throughout her military career. She had been climbing since before she could properly walk. Her grandmother used to tell stories of how baby Sarah would scale the furniture in their small apartment, always reaching for something higher, always pushing toward the unreachable. By age 5, she was climbing the oak trees behind their house with such skill that neighbors would gather to watch the tiny girl navigate branches like a spider. The nickname Falcon came during her first week of basic training. While other recruits struggled with the obstacle courses, Sarah moved through them as if gravity held less power over her than it did over others. She could scale a 20-foot wall in under 10 seconds, navigate rope courses blindfolded, and had never failed a single physical challenge put before her. Her commanding officers initially assumed she had extensive rock climbing experience, or perhaps came from a family of mountain guides. The truth was far more complex and infinitely more interesting. Sarah had grown up in poverty in the industrial heart of Detroit. Her mother worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table, and her father had disappeared when Sarah was barely 2 years old. The family lived in a 4th-floor apartment with no elevator. And from the time Sarah could walk, she was climbing those stairs multiple times a day. But it wasn't just the stairs that shaped her unusual abilities. Their apartment building was old and poorly maintained. The fire escape was rusted and dangerous, but it became Sarah's playground. While other children played with dolls or video games, Sarah spent her afternoons testing her limits on that metal framework outside their window. She learned to read the strength of bolts by the sound they made when she tested them, to judge the integrity of metal by its color and texture. Her mother, Elena, worked the night shift at a hospital, the early morning shift at a diner, and spent her afternoons cleaning offices downtown. She rarely saw Sarah's adventures on the fire escape, and Sarah learned early to be careful, to never let her mother worry more than she already did. When Sarah was 8, their building caught fire. It started in the basement and spread quickly through the old wooden framework. The main stairwell filled with smoke within minutes, trapping dozens of families above the 3rd floor. While firefighters set up their equipment and tried to reach the upper floors, 8-year-old Sarah Chen did something that would change her life forever. She climbed down the outside of the building, not using the fire escape, which was blocked by flames shooting from a 2nd-floor window, but using the actual brick facade of the building. Her small fingers found mortar gaps that adults couldn't even see, and her light weight allowed her to trust in handholds that would never support a grown person. The firefighters below watched in horror as this tiny girl descended 4 stories down the outside of a burning building. When she reached the ground safely, she immediately turned around and began climbing back up. "My mom's up there," she told the fire chief, who tried to stop her. "I can get to her." What followed was something that emergency responders still talk about 20 years later. Sarah climbed back up the building, not to the 4th floor where she lived, but to the 5th and 6th floors where other families were trapped. She guided 13 people to safety that day, showing them handholds and foot placements that she could see, but they couldn't, essentially serving as a human ladder for people twice her size. The local news covered the story, calling her the Spider Girl of Detroit. But Sarah hated the attention. She didn't want to be famous for something that felt as natural to her as walking. When reporters asked her how she learned to climb like that, she would just shrug and say she didn't know. The truth was, she really didn't know. It wasn't something she had learned in any conventional sense. Heights didn't frighten her because they felt familiar. Her body seemed to understand balance and leverage in ways that defied explanation. She could look at any surface and immediately see the path upward, as if her brain processed the physical world through a different lens than other people. After the fire, social services became involved. Elena was working too many hours to properly supervise her daughter, and Sarah's climbing was now considered dangerous rather than impressive. They threatened to place Sarah in foster care unless Elena could prove she could provide adequate supervision. That's when Marcus Webb entered their lives. Marcus was a retired Army Ranger who had been injured in Afghanistan and returned home to Detroit to work with at-risk youth. He had heard about Sarah's rescue efforts and was curious about this child who seemed to possess abilities that he had only seen in elite soldiers. He offered to work with Sarah 2 afternoons a week, teaching her proper climbing techniques and safety protocols. Elena, desperate to keep her daughter out of the foster system, agreed. Marcus quickly realized that Sarah didn't need to be taught how to climb. She needed to be taught how to think about climbing differently. Her natural abilities were extraordinary, but they were also dangerous because they came without the learned caution that kept most climbers alive. "You climb like you're part bird," he told her during their 3rd session together. "But even birds have to be smart about wind and weather." Marcus introduced Sarah to equipment she had never seen before. Ropes and harnesses, carabiners and climbing shoes, helmets and safety gear that professional climbers use to protect themselves. More importantly, he taught her to think strategically about her climbs. "Your body knows how to do this," he would say, "but your mind needs to plan 3 moves ahead." Under Marcus's guidance, Sarah began to understand that her natural gifts could be developed into something much more powerful. He taught her about different types of rock, about weather conditions that made climbing dangerous, about how to read topographical maps and plan routes that others couldn't see. By the time Sarah was 12, she could climb routes that challenged adults with decades of experience. Marcus had introduced her to the local climbing community, and she quickly became something of a legend. Climbers would travel from other states just to watch the young girl who could scale surfaces that seemed impossible. But Marcus saw something in Sarah that went beyond climbing. He recognized the same qualities he had seen in the most elite soldiers he had served with. The ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, to make split-second decisions with limited information, to push through physical and mental barriers that stopped other people. When Sarah turned 16, Marcus made a suggestion that would change the trajectory of her life entirely. "Have you ever thought about the military?" he asked one afternoon as they packed up their gear after a challenging climb in the nearby state park. Sarah had never considered it. The military seemed like something for other people. People from families with traditions of service. People who knew how to navigate institutional systems. She was just a girl from Detroit who happened to be good at climbing. "I'm not sure I'm military material," she said. Marcus laughed. "Sarah, in my 20 years of service, I met maybe 5 people who had your combination of physical ability, mental toughness, and strategic thinking, and none of them could do what you do on a rock face." He explained to her how the military was changing, how they were looking for people with unique skill sets for specialized operations. He told her about units that operated in mountainous terrain, about missions that required individuals who could access locations that helicopters couldn't reach and traditional ground forces couldn't approach. "You have gifts that could save lives," he told her. "Real lives. In real situations." Sarah was 17 when she first met with a military recruiter. The meeting was arranged by Marcus, who had made some calls to former colleagues still in service. The recruiter, a woman named Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, had seen Sarah's climbing videos that Marcus had shared. "We're not just looking for soldiers," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes explained. "We're looking for soldiers who can do things that others can't. Your climbing ability is just the beginning. What we're really interested in is how your mind works under pressure." She offered Sarah a chance to attend a special pre-enlistment program, a 2-week intensive that would test both her physical and mental capabilities. It wasn't a commitment to join the military, just an opportunity to see if she might be suited for specialized service. Sarah accepted the offer, partly out of curiosity and partly because Marcus had convinced her that she had an obligation to explore how her abilities might serve others. The pre-enlistment program was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. It took place at a facility in Colorado, in mountain terrain that reminded her of the climbing areas where she had spent so much time with Marcus. But this wasn't recreational climbing. This was about using climbing skills in tactical situations. On the first day, Sarah was given a scenario. A helicopter had crashed on a mountain ledge that conventional rescue teams couldn't reach. The crew was injured, and enemy forces were approaching. Her mission was to reach the crash site, assess the situation, and guide a rescue operation. What the instructors didn't know was that for Sarah, this scenario felt remarkably similar to that day in Detroit when she had climbed the burning building to help trapped families. The pressure was familiar. The need to move quickly while staying safe was something she understood instinctively. She completed the exercise in half the expected time. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah faced increasingly complex challenges. Night climbs with limited equipment, ascending surfaces while carrying heavy packs, navigating routes while under simulated enemy fire. Each exercise was designed to push recruits beyond their comfort zones, to see how they performed when physical exhaustion met mental pressure. Sarah thrived in every scenario. On the final day of the program, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "In my 15 years of running this program, I've seen a lot of exceptional people," she said. "But I've never seen anyone adapt to tactical climbing the way you do. You don't just climb. You solve three-dimensional puzzles at speed." She explained that there were units within the military that operated in extreme terrain, units that needed individuals who could access impossible locations and complete missions that couldn't be accomplished through conventional means. "I'm going to be direct with you," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes continued. "If you enlist, and if you complete the training programs I think you're capable of completing, you'll be joining operations that most people don't know exist. The work is dangerous. The training is brutal. And the missions are critical to national security." Sarah felt something click into place as she listened. All her life, she had been exceptional at something that seemed to have no real purpose beyond personal challenge. Here was someone telling her that her abilities could matter in ways she had never imagined. "What would the training involve?" Sarah asked. "Everything," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes replied. "Advanced climbing, tactical operations, weapons training, survival skills, intelligence gathering, emergency medical training. You'd be learning to operate alone in hostile territory, to complete objectives that conventional forces can't accomplish." Sarah thought about her mother, working 3 jobs to support them. She thought about Marcus, who had seen something in her that she hadn't seen in herself. She thought about the families she had helped escape from the burning building all those years ago, and how good it had felt to use her abilities to help other people. "When would I start?" she asked. 3 months later, Sarah Chen enlisted in the United States Army. Her mother was terrified and proud in equal measure. Marcus was simply proud. "You're going to do things that matter," he told her on the day before she left for basic training. "But remember, being exceptional at something is just the beginning. What you do with those abilities is what defines you." Basic training was almost comically easy for Sarah. While other recruits struggled with physical challenges, she was already planning her next moves through advanced training programs. Her drill instructors quickly realized they had someone unusual in their group. "Chen climbs like she was born in a tree," one of them noted in her evaluation. "Natural balance. No fear of heights. And she thinks 3 moves ahead. Recommend for advanced training immediately." After basic training, Sarah was selected for the Army's Mountain Warfare School. The program was designed to prepare soldiers for operations in extreme altitude and challenging terrain. Most soldiers found the training brutally difficult. Sarah found it felt like coming home. She learned to operate in conditions that would incapacitate most people. Thin air, extreme cold, treacherous terrain that could kill with a single misstep. But more than that, she learned to think tactically about climbing, how to approach a target from an unexpected angle, how to reach locations that enemies wouldn't think to defend, how to extract from dangerous situations when conventional routes weren't available. Her instructors began calling her Falcon during her 3rd week at Mountain Warfare School. The nickname came from Captain Rodriguez, who was watching Sarah navigate a particularly challenging night climb. "She doesn't climb that mountain," he told his colleague. "She flies up it." The name stuck, and Sarah found she liked it. It captured something about how climbing felt to her, something that Spider Girl never had. When she climbed, she did feel like she was flying, like she was meant to be in the air between earth and sky. After Mountain Warfare School, Sarah was selected for Ranger training. The program was notoriously difficult, with a failure rate that exceeded 70%. Sarah not only completed the training, she graduated at the top of her class. Her final evaluation from Ranger School was remarkable. Private Chen demonstrates exceptional tactical thinking, outstanding physical capabilities, and unusual calm under extreme pressure. Her climbing abilities are beyond anything we've seen in this program. Recommend for immediate consideration for specialized units. That recommendation led to a meeting that would change everything. Sarah was called to a briefing room at Fort Bragg, where she met with officers she didn't recognize, wearing uniforms without unit designations. They asked her questions that seemed unrelated to standard military operations. How did she feel about working alone for extended periods? Could she maintain cover identities? How did she react to unexpected changes in mission parameters? We understand you've developed quite a reputation for vertical mobility, one of the officers said. We're interested in someone with your skill set for operations that require access to locations that conventional forces can't reach. They were vague about details, but they painted a picture of missions that would test everything she had learned and everything she was naturally capable of. Operations in foreign territory. Objectives that required someone who could approach targets from angles that enemies wouldn't anticipate. We're not asking for a commitment, the officer continued. We're asking if you'd be interested in additional training that would prepare you for this type of work. Sarah looked around the room at these men and women who represented something beyond her current understanding of military service. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a burning building in Detroit to this moment where she was being recruited for operations she couldn't yet comprehend. What would the training involve? She asked. The officer smiled. Everything you've learned so far has been preparation. What we're offering is the real education. 6 months later, Sarah was deep in a training program that had no official name and left no official records. She learned skills that weren't taught in any conventional military school: how to blend into foreign environments, how to gather intelligence without detection, how to use her climbing abilities to access secure facilities. The training was conducted by instructors who were legends in the special operations community. Former Delta Force operators, retired Navy SEALs, CIA operatives who had spent careers working in hostile territory. They taught Sarah things that couldn't be found in any manual. Your climbing ability is your primary asset, one instructor told her. But it's useless if you can't think like an intelligence operative. You need to become invisible until the moment you need to be extraordinary. Sarah learned to become both. She could blend into a crowd of tourists in any major city, speaking local languages well enough to pass casual inspection. But when the mission required it, she could transform into something that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Her first real assignment came after 18 months of training. The briefing was conducted in a secure facility she would never be able to find again. The mission was simple in concept, extraordinarily difficult in execution. A high-value target was being held in a compound built into the side of a mountain in a hostile nation. Conventional rescue attempts were impossible due to the terrain and the security measures in place, but there was a route to the compound that no one would expect anyone to use: a sheer rock face that rose 800 feet above a valley floor. Intelligence suggests the target is being held in a room on the eastern face of the compound, the briefing officer explained. The room has a window that opens onto what the captors believe is an impossible approach. They're wrong. Sarah studied the satellite images and topographical maps. The climb would be challenging, but not impossible. The real difficulty would be what came after the climb: extracting a potentially injured person down the same route she had used to ascend. Timeline? She asked. 48 hours. Target must be extracted before they're moved to a more secure location. Sarah nodded. She had trained for exactly this type of mission, though she had never imagined her first real operation would be quite so dramatic. 2 days later, she was halfway around the world, standing at the base of a mountain that rose like a knife blade into the dark sky above. Her equipment was minimal by design. Anything beyond the absolute essentials would slow her down and increase her chances of detection. As she began her ascent, Sarah felt the familiar calm that had carried her through every challenge since that day in Detroit, when she had first climbed down the side of a burning building. This was what she had been training for her entire life, even when she didn't know she was training. 800 feet above the valley floor, a window glowed with faint light. Behind that window, someone was waiting for rescue. Sarah adjusted her grip and continued climbing toward a destiny she was only beginning to understand. The mountain air was thin at 800 feet, and Sarah's breath created small clouds that disappeared quickly in the cold night wind. Her fingers found their rhythm on the rock face, each handhold calculated and precise. Below her, the valley floor was lost in darkness, but she had memorized every detail of the terrain during her approach. The compound carved into the mountainside grew larger as she climbed. Intelligence photos hadn't captured the scale of the structure. What had looked like a simple building built into the rock was actually a complex network of tunnels and chambers that extended deep into the mountain itself. Sarah reached a small ledge 60 feet below her target window and paused to assess the situation. The intelligence briefing had mentioned minimal security on the eastern face because the approach was considered impossible. They were right about it being nearly impossible, but they had underestimated what nearly impossible meant to someone like Sarah. Through her scope, she could see 2 guards patrolling the main courtyard on the western side of the compound. Their patrol pattern was predictable, following the same route every 12 minutes. The eastern face, where Sarah was positioned, showed no signs of activity. She resumed her climb, moving more slowly now as she approached the target window. Each placement had to be perfect. One loose rock, one miscalculated reach, and the mission would end before it began. The window was exactly where the intelligence photos had indicated. Through the reinforced glass, Sarah could see a figure sitting on a simple cot, head down, apparently sleeping. The room was small and stark, clearly designed for confinement rather than comfort. Sarah positioned herself on a narrow ledge directly beside the window and activated her communication device. Falcon to base. In position at target window. Visual confirmation of package. Copy, Falcon. Proceed with entry. Sarah had trained for this exact scenario. The window was secured with a simple latch from the inside, designed to prevent someone from getting out, rather than stopping someone from getting in. She used a thin metal tool to manipulate the latch through a gap in the window frame. The figure on the cot looked up as the window opened. It was a woman, perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that widened in surprise as Sarah appeared at her window, 800 feet above the valley floor. "Dr. Martinez?" Sarah whispered. The woman nodded, apparently too surprised to speak. "I'm here to get you out. Can you climb?" Dr. Elena Martinez was a biochemist who had been kidnapped 3 weeks earlier while conducting research in the region. Her work involved developing treatments for diseases that affected populations in remote areas. Research that had apparently made her valuable to the wrong people. "I can climb," Dr. Martinez whispered back. "But not like that." She gestured toward the sheer drop below the window. Sarah had anticipated this problem. She secured a lightweight rope to anchor points she had identified during her ascent, creating a system that would allow her to guide Dr. Martinez down the mountain face while bearing most of her weight. "I'm going to attach this harness to you," Sarah explained quickly. "I'll control the descent. You just need to keep your feet against the rock and trust me." Dr. Martinez looked terrified but determined. "How did you get up here?" "I climbed," Sarah said simply. "And now we're both going to climb down." The extraction took 40 minutes. Sarah had trained for emergency descents with injured or incapacitated persons, but this was her first real-world application of those skills. Dr. Martinez was brave and followed instructions well, but she was clearly not accustomed to hanging 800 feet above solid ground with only a rope between her and a fatal fall. When they reached the valley floor, Dr. Martinez collapsed from exhaustion and relief. Sarah immediately activated her emergency beacon, calling for the extraction team that was positioned 5 miles away. "How long have you been climbing?" Dr. Martinez asked, as they waited. "My whole life," Sarah replied. "But I've been doing this kind of climbing for about 2 years." "This kind of climbing?" "The kind where people's lives depend on it." The extraction team arrived within 30 minutes. As they prepared to leave the area, Dr. Martinez pulled Sarah aside. "What you did tonight," she said. "That wasn't just climbing. That was something else entirely." Sarah didn't respond, but she understood what Dr. Martinez meant. Somewhere during the mission, she had crossed a line between being someone who was good at climbing and being someone who used climbing as a tool for operations that others couldn't accomplish. The debriefing took place 3 days later in the same anonymous facility where Sarah had received her original briefing. The mission was classified as a complete success, and Dr. Martinez had been returned safely to her research team. "Outstanding work, Falcon," the briefing officer said. "The target extraction was completed ahead of schedule, with no detection by hostile forces." Sarah nodded, but she was already thinking about what came next. The mission had felt almost routine to her, despite being her first real operation. She had found herself planning alternative routes even as she climbed, thinking 3 steps ahead in case the primary plan encountered complications. "We have additional missions that require your specific skill set," the officer continued. "Are you ready for increased operational tempo?" Over the next 18 months, Sarah completed 7 more operations. Each mission was different, but they all involved accessing locations that conventional forces couldn't reach. An arms dealer's penthouse apartment on the 40th floor of a building in Eastern Europe, a terrorist safe house built into sea cliffs on a remote island, a data server housed in a facility constructed inside a mountain cave system. With each mission, Sarah's reputation within the special operations community grew. She became known as someone who could accomplish the impossible, someone who could appear where enemies least expected her. But it was her 8th mission that would change everything. The briefing took place in a different facility, with different officers wearing different uniforms. For the first time, Sarah found herself working with a joint task force that included representatives from multiple branches of the military. "The target is a facility that intelligence agencies have been trying to access for 3 years, the Navy commander who led the briefing explained. "It's built into a series of sea caves on the coast of a hostile nation. The only land access requires a climb that our technical teams have assessed as impossible." Sarah studied the reconnaissance photos and technical drawings. The facility was indeed built into sea caves, but the approach wasn't simply difficult, it was genuinely dangerous. The climb would have to be made from sea level, up a cliff face that was constantly battered by waves, during specific tidal conditions that would only provide a 4-hour window for the operation. "What makes this facility so important?" Sarah asked. The commander exchanged glances with his colleagues before responding. "Intelligence suggests they're developing biological weapons. Dr. Martinez, the researcher you extracted 18 months ago, has provided information suggesting that her research was stolen and is being weaponized at this location." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the briefing room. Her first mission was connected to this one, in ways she hadn't anticipated. "The facility can't be accessed by conventional forces," the commander continued. "Satellite imagery shows the cave system is too complex for aerial assault, and naval approaches are prevented by underwater obstacles and shore-based defensive systems." He pointed to a section of the cliff face in the reconnaissance photos. "But there's this." What he was indicating was barely visible in the images, a series of natural hand and footholds that led from a narrow beach up the cliff face to what appeared to be a concealed entrance to the cave system. "Our technical climbing experts estimate that this route would require capabilities that are beyond current military climbing standards," the commander said. "Beyond current standards for anyone, except possibly one person." Sarah realized they were talking about her. "Timeline?" she asked. 72 hours. "Intelligence suggests they're preparing to test their biological weapons. If we don't stop them now, we may not get another chance." Sarah studied the photos more carefully. The climb was dangerous, but not impossible. The real challenge would be what came after the climb. Unlike her previous missions, this wasn't a simple extraction. She would need to penetrate a hostile facility, gather intelligence about biological weapons development, and potentially sabotage their operations. "What support will I have?" she asked. "A Navy SEAL team will be positioned offshore in case you need emergency extraction. They'll also provide overwatch and communication support during the operation." This was the first time Sarah would be working with Navy SEALs. She had heard about them, of course, but her previous operations had always been solo affairs with minimal support. The SEAL team leader is Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison. He and his team specialize in maritime operations, and they've been briefed on your unique capabilities. 3 days later, Sarah found herself on a submarine positioned 12 miles off the coast of her target. The submarine was unlike anything she had experienced before, a floating command center equipped with technology she couldn't begin to understand. Lieutenant Commander Morrison was exactly what Sarah had expected a Navy SEAL to be: tall, athletic, clearly intelligent, and carrying himself with the quiet confidence that came from years of dangerous operations. What she hadn't expected was his reaction to meeting her. "So you're Falcon," he said when they were introduced. "I've heard some interesting stories." "What kind of stories?" Sarah asked. Morrison smiled. "The kind of stories that sound impossible until you meet the person who actually did them." Morrison's team consisted of 6 other SEALs, all of whom had been briefed on Sarah's climbing abilities but clearly weren't sure what to expect. Sarah could see them watching her during the mission briefings, trying to reconcile the relatively small woman in front of them with the stories they had heard. "The plan is straightforward," Morrison explained, as they reviewed the operation timeline. "We'll get you within 200 meters of the target beach using inflatable boats. You'll make the climb during optimal tidal conditions, which will give you approximately 4 hours to complete the mission and return to the extraction point." Sarah nodded. 4 hours was plenty of time for the climb itself, but she wasn't sure how long the intelligence gathering would take once she was inside the facility. "What if I need more time?" she asked. "Then we wait," Morrison replied. "This operation succeeds or fails based on your ability to access that facility. We're here to support you, not the other way around." Sarah had worked solo for so long that having a team dedicated to supporting her felt strange, but as Morrison's team prepared for the operation, she began to appreciate the level of professionalism and expertise they brought to the mission. The approach to the target went perfectly. The submarine delivered them to within 5 miles of the coast, where they transferred to high-speed inflatable boats that were virtually undetectable by radar. Morrison's team navigated through hostile waters with the kind of precision that came from extensive training and real-world experience. As they approached the target beach, Sarah could see the cliff face rising from the water like a wall of black stone. Intelligence photos hadn't captured the scale of what she would be climbing. The cliff was nearly vertical, constantly sprayed by waves that crashed against the rocks below. "Falcon, you have visual on your route?" Morrison asked through the communication system. Sarah studied the cliff face through her scope. In the darkness, she could just make out the hand and footholds that would carry her up to the cave entrance. The route was challenging but climbable. "I have visual," she replied, beginning ascent in 2 minutes. Sarah entered the water wearing a specially designed climbing suit that would protect her from the cold and provide some insulation against the constant spray from the waves. Her equipment was minimal, just the essential gear needed to complete the climb and the mission. The first 50 feet of the climb were the most dangerous. Waves crashed against the cliff face every few seconds, and Sarah had to time her movements to avoid being swept from the rock by the force of the water. Her hands and feet found purchase on stone that was constantly wet and slippery. But as she climbed higher, away from the reach of all but the largest waves, the ascent became more manageable. The natural handholds were exactly where the reconnaissance photos had indicated, and Sarah found herself making steady progress up the cliff face. "Falcon, you're looking good from our position," Morrison's voice came through her earpiece. "Current time is 2300 hours. Sarah acknowledged the time check and continued climbing. The cave entrance was still 100 feet above her, but she could see the darker shadow in the cliff face that marked her destination. As she approached the cave entrance, Sarah could hear sounds from inside the facility. Machinery, voices, and what sounded like construction activity. Whatever was happening inside the caves, it was happening on a significant scale. She reached the cave entrance at exactly 23:30 hours. The opening was concealed behind a natural rock formation, but once she maneuvered around the barrier, she found herself looking into a tunnel that had been carved from the living rock. Sarah activated her night vision equipment and began moving into the facility. The tunnel extended deeper into the mountain than she had anticipated, and within 50 meters, she encountered the first signs of serious security measures: motion sensors, cameras, and what appeared to be automated defensive systems. This wasn't just a hidden laboratory, it was a fortress built into the mountain. Sarah used techniques she had learned during her intelligence training to bypass the security systems. Moving slowly and carefully, she made her way deeper into the facility until she reached a large chamber that had been carved from the heart of the mountain. What she found there was beyond anything the intelligence briefing had prepared her for. The chamber contained a laboratory facility that was larger and more sophisticated than anything she had seen before. But it wasn't just the scale that shocked her. It was what they were working on. Through observation windows, Sarah could see research areas containing what appeared to be biological samples and testing equipment. But more disturbing were the holding areas that contained what looked like human test subjects. Sarah realized she wasn't just looking at a weapons development facility. She was looking at something much worse. She activated her recording equipment and began documenting everything she could see. The mission had been to gather intelligence about biological weapons development. But what she was witnessing suggested something far more sinister. As she moved through the facility, Sarah began to understand the scope of what was happening. The research wasn't just about developing biological weapons. It was about developing weapons that could target specific genetic markers. Weapons that could be designed to affect only certain populations, while leaving others unharmed. She was looking at the development of genocide weapons. Sarah spent 2 hours moving through the facility, documenting everything she could access. The security systems were sophisticated, but they were designed to stop conventional intrusions, not someone who had entered through what everyone assumed was an impossible route. As she prepared to leave, Sarah encountered something that changed her understanding of the entire mission. In a secured office area, she found documents that indicated this facility was just one of several sites around the world. The research she was documenting was part of a larger program that involved multiple nations and organizations. But more shocking was the list of targets. The documents contained detailed plans for deploying the weapons they were developing against specific population centers, cities around the world where millions of people lived, unaware that they had been selected for elimination. Sarah photographed every document she could find, understanding that what she was carrying out of this facility could prevent one of the largest mass murders in human history. As she made her way back toward the cave entrance, Sarah heard alarms beginning to sound throughout the facility. Something had triggered their security systems, though she wasn't sure what. "Falcon, we're seeing increased activity around your position." Morrison's voice came through her earpiece. Multiple vehicles approaching the facility from land-based routes. Sarah realized her presence had been detected somehow, though she had been careful to avoid all the security measures she had identified. "Copy. Beginning extraction now." But as Sarah reached the cave entrance, she discovered that extraction wasn't going to be as simple as reversing her climbing route. The tide had changed while she was inside the facility, and the waves were now reaching much higher up the cliff face. The route she had used to ascend was no longer viable for descent. "Morrison, I need alternative extraction options," Sarah reported. "Falcon, can you reach a different position for pickup?" Sarah studied the cliff face around the cave entrance. In daylight and calm conditions, she might be able to traverse to a different route, but in darkness, with waves crashing against the rocks below and hostile forces approaching the facility, her options were extremely limited. That's when Sarah made a decision that would earn her a place in Special Operations legend. Instead of trying to climb down the cliff face, she decided to climb up. "Morrison, I'm going to the top of the cliff. Can you extract me from there?" There was a pause before Morrison responded. "Falcon, that climb is over 300 feet of additional vertical distance." "Copy. Beginning ascent." What followed was a climb that defied every rational assessment of risk and possibility. Sarah ascended the cliff face above the cave entrance in complete darkness, while hostile forces searched the facility below, and waves crashed against rocks 300 feet beneath her. She reached the top of the cliff 40 minutes later, having completed one of the most difficult climbs of her career, under conditions that would have challenged the world's best climbers. Morrison's extraction helicopter was waiting for her. As the helicopter lifted off and carried her away from the hostile coast, Sarah realized that something had changed during this mission. She had crossed another line, moving from someone who could accomplish difficult missions to someone who could accomplish missions that others would consider impossible. "Outstanding work, Falcon," Morrison said as they headed back toward the submarine. "I've never seen anything like that climb." Sarah nodded, but she was already thinking about the intelligence she was carrying. The documents and recordings she had gathered would expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond a single weapons facility. What she didn't know was that this mission would also expose her to a level of attention that would change her life in ways she couldn't anticipate. The intelligence she had gathered was so significant that it would be briefed to the highest levels of government. Her name, and her abilities, would become known to people who operated at levels of power and secrecy that she had never imagined. 3 weeks later, Sarah was called to a meeting at a facility she had never seen before, with people whose names she would never learn. "The intelligence you gathered has prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack," one of the officials told her. "But it has also exposed a network of facilities and operations that we need to address." Sarah listened as they outlined a series of missions that would build on the intelligence she had provided. Facilities around the world that needed to be accessed. Operations that would require her unique combination of climbing ability and operational skills. "What we're asking you to do," the official continued, "goes beyond any single mission. We're asking you to become part of a long-term operation that may take years to complete." Sarah thought about the documents she had photographed. The evidence of plans to eliminate millions of innocent people. She thought about Dr. Martinez, whose research had been stolen and weaponized, and about all the people whose lives depended on stopping the conspiracy she had uncovered. "What would this operation involve?" she asked. The official smiled grimly. "Everything you've learned so far has been preparation. What we're offering is the chance to prevent a genocide." "That's Con," AD said. That's Con Rays." 6 months later, Sarah was operating in locations around the world, gathering intelligence and conducting operations that were dismantling a network of facilities dedicated to developing weapons of mass destruction. Each mission was more complex and more dangerous than the last, but Sarah found that her abilities continued to evolve to meet the challenges. She was no longer just someone who could climb impossible routes. She had become someone who could access any location, no matter how well defended, no matter how carefully concealed. But as her reputation grew within the special operations community, so did the attention from people who represented threats she was only beginning to understand. The conspiracy she had uncovered involved powerful people who had invested enormous resources in their plans for global population reduction. They were not going to allow one person, no matter how capable, to destroy years of work and planning. Sarah was about to discover that being exceptional at climbing was just the first requirement for survival in a world where the most dangerous enemies were the ones you never saw coming. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison had seen impossible things during his 12 years as a Navy SEAL, but nothing had prepared him for working with Sarah Chen. Over the past 8 months, he and his team had provided support for 7 of her operations, and each mission had left them more convinced that what they were witnessing defied rational explanation. "Sir, respectfully, no one climbs like that," Petty Officer Martinez had said after Sarah's 4th mission with their team. "I've worked with Force Recon climbers, Army Rangers, mountain rescue specialists. What she does isn't just better, it's different." Morrison had initially dismissed his team's observations as the normal awe that came from working with someone genuinely exceptional. But after months of watching Sarah operate, he was beginning to think there was something more fundamental about her abilities that they weren't understanding. The mission that changed everything began with a briefing that was unlike any they had received before. Instead of targeting a specific facility, they were being asked to intercept a mobile laboratory that intelligence agencies had been tracking for 6 weeks. "The target is a converted cargo ship operating in international waters," the briefing officer explained. "Intelligence suggests they're conducting final testing of biological weapons before moving to deployment phase." Sarah studied the reconnaissance photos of the cargo ship. It was larger than she had expected, with multiple levels of superstructure that would provide numerous climbing routes. But something about the mission felt different. "Why can't this be handled by conventional naval forces?" she asked. "The ship is equipped with defensive systems that make a conventional assault too risky," the officer replied. "Additionally, the weapons they're testing are extremely volatile. Any impact or explosion could release biological agents over a wide area." Sarah understood. This wasn't just about accessing a difficult target. It was about doing so without triggering a release of weapons that could kill thousands of people. "The target ship will be in position approximately 200 nautical miles off the Pacific coast in 18 hours, the briefing officer continued. "You'll have a narrow window when weather conditions will allow an approach." Morrison and his team would provide maritime support from a position 5 miles from the target ship. Sarah would approach using a high-speed inflatable boat, board the ship, locate the laboratory facility, and plant surveillance equipment that would allow intelligence agencies to monitor the final stages of weapons testing. But as they prepared for the mission, Morrison noticed something he had never seen before. Sarah seemed nervous. "Everything okay, Falcon?" he asked as they reviewed the approach routes. Sarah looked up from the reconnaissance photos she had been studying. "Something feels wrong about this mission." Morrison had learned to trust Sarah's instincts. In 8 months of operations, she had never been wrong when she expressed concerns about a mission. "What's bothering you?" he asked. "The timing," Sarah said. "Intelligence has been tracking this ship for 6 weeks. But we're only moving now when they're supposedly in final testing phase. Why wait until the most dangerous moment?" Morrison studied the mission timeline. Sarah was right. It was unusual to wait until weapons testing was at its most advanced stage before attempting intervention. "Maybe they needed time to develop an approach that wouldn't trigger weapons release," Morrison suggested. Sarah shook her head. "Or maybe someone wanted to wait until the weapons were fully developed before moving." The implication hung in the air between them. Sarah was suggesting that someone might want the weapons testing to proceed, that the mission might not be what it appeared to be. 18 hours later, they were approaching the target coordinates under cover of darkness. The cargo ship was exactly where intelligence had predicted, running without lights and maintaining radio silence. As Sarah transferred from Morrison's boat to her solo approach craft, she had an uneasy feeling that intensified as she got closer to the target ship. "Morrison, something's not right here," she reported through her communication system. "The ship is showing no security activity. No patrols. No watch posts. Nothing. Maybe they think they're safe in international waters," Morrison replied. But his voice carried the same uncertainty that Sarah was feeling. Sarah reached the cargo ship and began her ascent up the hull. The climb was routine, industrial climbing on steel surfaces with plenty of handholds and foot placements. But as she reached deck level, her concerns deepened. The ship appeared to be deserted. Sarah moved across the deck toward the superstructure where the laboratory was supposed to be located. Her night vision equipment showed no signs of human activity. No heat signatures. No indication that anyone was aboard. "Morrison, I'm seeing no personnel on deck. Ship appears abandoned." "Copy, Falcon. Proceed with caution." Sarah made her way into the superstructure, following intelligence maps that indicated the laboratory would be located 3 levels down from the main deck. But as she moved through the ship, she realized something was fundamentally wrong. The spaces she was moving through showed signs of recent abandonment. Equipment was still running, lights were on, but there were no people anywhere. When she reached the laboratory level, Sarah understood what had happened. The laboratory was empty. Not just of people, but of equipment. Whatever biological weapons research had been conducted on this ship, it had been moved before her arrival. "Morrison, the target is a dry hole. Laboratory has been cleared out." "Copy, Falcon. Begin extraction." But as Sarah moved back toward her extraction route, she heard something that made her freeze. Footsteps on the deck above her. Multiple sets of footsteps moving with tactical precision. The ship wasn't abandoned, it was a trap. "Morrison, I have multiple hostiles moving into position above my location. This is a setup." Sarah could hear Morrison's team reacting to her report, but she was already moving, using her knowledge of the ship's layout to find alternative routes toward her extraction point. As she moved through the lower levels of the ship, Sarah realized the full scope of what was happening. The mission had been designed to get her aboard this ship, isolated from Morrison's team, where she could be captured or eliminated. Someone within the intelligence community was working with the conspiracy she had been fighting for the past year. Someone had decided that Sarah Chen, call sign Falcon, had become too dangerous to the operation she had been disrupting. Sarah reached the deck level and could see Morrison's boat approximately 5 miles away. But between her and extraction were at least 20 hostile operatives who had been waiting for her arrival. She activated her emergency beacon and began moving toward what she hoped would be the least defended section of the ship's perimeter. "Falcon, we see your beacon. Moving to intercept. But we're 15 minutes out," Morrison reported. 15 minutes was too long. Sarah needed to find a way off the ship immediately, before the hostile forces could organize their search and capture her. That's when Sarah made a decision that would change Morrison's understanding of everything he thought he knew about her. Instead of trying to hide on the ship until Morrison's team could reach her, Sarah went up. She began climbing the ship's main communications mast, a structure that rose over 100 feet above the deck. Her pursuers, trained in conventional tactics, had positioned themselves to intercept her escape routes. None of them had considered that she might simply climb out of their reach. From Morrison's position 5 miles away, watching through night vision equipment, what happened next was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. Sarah reached the top of the communications mast and then did something that seemed to defy the laws of physics. She jumped, not down toward the water, but across a gap of nearly 50 feet to reach the ship's forward crane assembly. Morrison watched her fly through the air, covering a distance that should have been impossible for a human being to jump. She landed on the crane structure and immediately began moving along the boom toward the ship's bow. But what Morrison was seeing through his scope wasn't just exceptional athleticism, it was something that seemed to transcend normal human capabilities. Sarah was moving through the air above the ship like she was flying. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered. "How is she doing that?" Sarah reached the end of the crane boom and jumped again, this time toward the ship's forward superstructure. The gap was even wider than her first jump, but she covered it with the same impossible grace. Morrison's team was transfixed, watching their scopes as Sarah moved across the ship's superstructure like she was weightless. "Skipper, that's not possible," Petty Officer Martinez said. "The human body can't generate that kind of horizontal momentum." But Morrison was beginning to understand something that his team hadn't grasped yet. What they were witnessing wasn't just exceptional climbing ability. Sarah was demonstrating capabilities that went beyond anything they had imagined possible. Sarah reached the ship's bow and did something that Morrison would replay in his mind for years afterward. She positioned herself at the edge of the deck, nearly 60 feet above the water, and jumped directly toward Morrison's boat, which was still over 4 miles away. For a moment, Morrison thought Sarah had chosen suicide rather than capture. No one could survive a fall into the ocean from that height, especially not while carrying full equipment and wearing a heavy climbing suit. But Sarah didn't fall. Morrison watched through his scope as Sarah glided through the air above the ocean's surface, covering distance at a rate that seemed impossible. She was flying, actually flying, using techniques and abilities that defied everything Morrison understood about human physiology. "Morrison, I'm approaching your position from bearing 270. Sarah's voice came through the communication system. "Morrison, great." Morrison looked toward the indicated bearing and saw what appeared to be a person approaching their boat through the air, approximately 30 feet above the water's surface. Sarah landed on Morrison's boat with perfect control, touching down on the deck as if she had simply stepped aboard from a dock. Morrison and his team stared at her in complete silence. "Request immediate extraction," Sarah said, as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Target location compromised, mission parameters changed." Morrison continued staring at her, trying to process what he had just witnessed. "Sarah," he said finally, "what the hell are you?" Sarah looked at Morrison and his team, all of whom were watching her with expressions that ranged from awe to fear. She realized that her escape from the cargo ship had revealed capabilities that she had spent her entire military career concealing. "I'm a climber," she said simply. "Climbers don't fly," Morrison replied. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, understanding that the secret she had protected for so long was now exposed to people whose opinions and discretion she trusted completely. "No," she said finally. "Most climbers don't." As Morrison's boat carried them away from the compromised mission site, Sarah began to explain things she had never told anyone, not even her handlers in the intelligence community. Her climbing abilities weren't just exceptional. They were genuinely superhuman. She had been born with genetic variations that affected her bone density, muscle fiber composition, and neural processing in ways that allowed her to perform feats that would be impossible for normal humans. "I don't just climb," she explained to Morrison's team. "My body processes gravity differently. I can control my trajectory through 3-dimensional space in ways that normal physics shouldn't allow." Morrison listened as Sarah described abilities that sounded like science fiction but explained everything he had witnessed over the past 8 months. When I was a child, I thought everyone could do what I could do. It wasn't until I was older that I realized I was different. She explained how her climbing abilities were just one manifestation of a broader set of capabilities that included enhanced spatial reasoning, perfect balance, and the ability to generate momentum and control her trajectory through space in ways that defied conventional understanding. The intelligence community recruited me because they thought I was just an exceptional climber, Sarah continued. They don't know about the other abilities. Morrison understood why Sarah had concealed her full capabilities. Someone with her abilities would become a subject for scientific study rather than an operational asset. She would be valuable to people who would see her as an opportunity for research rather than a human being with her own agenda. The people who set up tonight's trap, Morrison said. Do they know what you really are? Sarah shook her head. I don't think so. But if they capture me and study what I can do, they'll understand that I'm not just disrupting their operations. I'm something they could potentially replicate. Morrison realized the full implications of what Sarah was saying. If the conspiracy she had been fighting could somehow reproduce her abilities, they would have access to operatives who could access any location, who could complete missions that would be impossible for conventional forces. They can't be allowed to study you, Morrison said. No, Sarah agreed. They can't. Over the next several hours, as Morrison's team extracted from the compromised mission area, Sarah shared the full scope of her abilities and the missions she had been conducting for the past 2 years. She had been operating alone, taking missions that required someone who could access impossible locations and complete objectives that conventional forces couldn't accomplish. But more than that, she had been systematically dismantling a global conspiracy that involved people at the highest levels of government and industry. The weapons facility I accessed 8 months ago was just one small part of a much larger operation, Sarah explained. There are facilities around the world, research programs, and deployment plans that involve eliminating significant portions of the global population. Morrison listened as Sarah outlined a conspiracy that was far more extensive than anything his team had been briefed on. They weren't just dealing with a few rogue scientists developing biological weapons. They were confronting a coordinated effort involving multiple nations and organizations. Why work alone? Morrison asked. Why not build a team? Why not build a team? Because I didn't know who to trust, Sarah replied. The people who recruited me, the people who have been giving me missions, I don't know how many of them are actually working for the other side. Morrison understood. Sarah had been operating in a world where the normal command structures and support systems couldn't be trusted. Her supernatural abilities had made her valuable to everyone, including the enemies she was fighting. What happens now? Morrison asked. Sarah looked at Morrison and his team, people who had now seen her full capabilities and understood the scope of what she was really fighting. Now I'm going to finish what I started, she said. But I'm going to need help from people I can trust. Morrison made a decision that would change the course of his team's military careers. You have it, he said. Over the next 6 months, Morrison's SEAL team became Sarah's primary support unit for operations that targeted the remaining elements of the global conspiracy. Working together, they accessed facilities that had been considered impregnable, gathered intelligence that exposed corruption at the highest levels of government, and systematically dismantled a network that had been planning global genocide. Sarah's abilities, combined with Morrison's team's expertise in maritime and tactical operations, proved to be an unstoppable combination. They completed missions that intelligence agencies had considered impossible, and they did it while staying ahead of enemies who commanded enormous resources and influence. But more than that, Morrison and his team provided something Sarah had never had before. People who knew her full capabilities and still saw her as a human being rather than a weapon or a subject for study. You know what the real difference is? Morrison said to Sarah after their final mission, as they watched the last of the conspiracy's major facilities burn from their extraction point. What's that? Sarah asked. It's not just that you can fly, Morrison said. It's that you choose to use what you can do to help people. Sarah nodded, understanding what Morrison meant. Her abilities were extraordinary, but what made her special was how she chose to use them. So why do they really call you Falcon? Morrison asked. Sarah smiled, looking up at the sky above them. Because falcons don't just soar. They hunt, and they never miss their target. Morrison watched as Sarah prepared to disappear back into the world of classified operations and missions that would never appear in any official records, but he knew that somewhere out there would always be someone watching from impossible heights. Someone ready to drop from the sky when innocent people needed protection. They called her Falcon. And now Morrison understood exactly why. As Sarah melted back into the shadows of the special operations world, Morrison's team was left with memories of impossible feats, and the knowledge that sometimes the most extraordinary people were the ones who used their gifts not for personal gain, but to protect others from threats they would never see coming. The conspiracy they had fought was defeated. But Morrison knew there would always be new threats. New enemies who underestimated the woman who could appear anywhere and strike from angles they never expected. Somewhere in the night sky above them, Sarah Chen was already planning her next mission, ready to climb any height and cross any distance to protect the innocent from those who would do them harm. She was Falcon, and the sky was her domain.